Hi, hello, and welcome again, everybody, to another episode of Natural Juan. I was planning to lay low for the meantime as life has become really busy, but just recently I was sent an almost overwhelming amount of stories from friends and followers who found out about my latest video about the evil on Good Friday superstition in the Philippines. Apparently, there are people all over the country who have their own stories to tell about strange, difficult to explain events that take place on Good Friday here in the Philippines. Anyway, before we continue, here's a quick shout out to our sponsor, Dermhaven. Remember to practice good skincare habits if you don't want to look like something that escaped the bloody bowels of hell on Good Friday. And what better way to do that than to leave it to experts like Miss Rochelle Pineda. Special shout out too to Mr. Jonathan Green, a longtime supporter of this channel. Now, with all that out of the way, let us hear a story about evil on Good Friday and the Forsaken Chapel. Hi Juan, you guys can call me Pio. That's not my real name, but it's close enough. Anyway, I heard about your horror narrations about your most recent video about demons and other nasty things being up and about on Good Friday, and decided to share with you this very strange and horrifying experience I had in my younger days. Before we continue, let me tell you that I don't really believe that God actually dies on Good Friday, but I believe that evil out there is somehow stronger, or more willing to take risks to spite mankind than any other day of the year. It is, based on my experience at least, more terrifying than Halloween. Anyway, Juan, I hope you decide to read this story out to your audience, or legionnaires as you prefer to call them now. I'm not very good at English and public speaking, so I'll leave all that to you. So please translate my story so that even people from other countries might know about this creepy and deeply disturbing incident. Also, feel free to change the names of people and places in this story, as I don't want people to get the wrong impression about my birthplace, and I want to protect the privacy of everyone involved. Tourism is a big thing there, and I don't want to ruin any of that. This happened when I was a teenager, when I still lived on one of the many islands in the Visayas region of the Philippines. I was an altar boy at the time and was a favored assistant of the parish priest who was a foreigner from Scotland. Wait, I know what you're thinking, but it's not that kind of horror story. Those nasty and cruel priests are probably the reason that whatever evil is out there now grows stronger as it corrupts more and more of what is good and moral in the world. Nothing is more dangerous to Christendom than all the Christian cosplayers out there who say and do awful things while spouting Bible verses ad nauseam, but I digress. Anyway, life for me was quite simple then. Wake up, handle chores, go to school, help Father McAllister go home and watch anime, then go to sleep. On weekends it was wake up, handle chores, watch cartoons, help Father McAllister hold mass, help mom, do silly shenanigans with other kids and teens, then go home to sleep. However, one year would prove to be a little different. This is the year we would make an awful discovery about 3 kids in our town. We can call them Dom, Lucy, and Roy. Dom was the son of an OFW, or Overseas Filipino Worker, and was one of the more well-to-do kids in town. He was 12 then, and probably only got mixed into this mess because he was trying to look after the other 2. Lucy was 10 at the time, and was Dom's cousin, but belonged to one of the less fortunate families on the island. Then of course there was Roy, who was just 8, and had no real idea of what he and his friends had gotten themselves into. Belonging to a middle-class family on the island, he ended up becoming the worst victim of the thing in the Forsaken Chapel, and barely escaped with his life. As a grown man, I have nothing against people not going to church. It's their right if they don't want to, especially the people who belong to a different religion or don't have a religion at all. It's how Pope Francis, Lord bless that old man's soul, would want it. However, one day, those 3 kids I mentioned earlier stopped going to church. Like I said, I respect other people's beliefs, but the thing was, these kids would go off without their parents' permission. They would either vanish before their parents could get to church with them, or would slip from their parents' perception during Mass. It got so bad that Father McAllister would sometimes have to pause Mass just to look for the three children. We would eventually find the three of them either just outside the church or back in their respective homes, so we ignored these incidents at first. No one had any idea just how bad it would get later on. When things were still somewhat normal, or rather before everything went to hell literally, the three kids got a chance to speak with Father McAllister. He was normally a serious man with an imposing height and a graying head of hair and a particularly thick beard. However, the kids were unafraid of speaking to the old priest, and while he was fond of children, it was in a completely wholesome way, I assure you. The children asked Father McAllister a bunch of strange questions, but Dom did most of the talking. The old priest didn't mind answering their questions, even though they got more and more disturbing as they went on. Some of the first questions they asked were about the Virgin Mary, and why she would stay in heaven after God allowed her son to die. Wasn't she angry that her child died while not only did God do nothing, but seemed to have planned it all from the beginning? Father McAllister only seemed amused at this and said that the Virgin Mary had absolute trust in the Lord, and while all of it must have hurt her, she knew that it was her son's destiny to sacrifice himself to save mankind from sin. Also, he did come back to life in the end, which changed everything. The next round of questions was about Jesus, and this touched upon the idea that he died on Good Friday, and that he had actually gone to hell afterward. The three children seemed to imply that with the death of Jesus and his descent to hell, there was really no salvation for mankind. Father McAllister then corrected them that while he did indeed die, and also went into the world of the dead, he rose again on the third day, and that he only really traveled to hell so that he could save those that could still be saved, such as those who were virtuous but not qualified enough to be in heaven, or were genuinely repentant for their sins. The old priest also added that while Jesus' life temporarily stopped on the cross, God the Father, or Yahweh, continued to exist and protect the world from the devil. The children became unhappy with this and soon left of their own accord. As time went on though, the disappearances of Dom, Lucy, and Roy became more and more frequent, and for longer and longer periods of time. It got to the point where their parents began to report that they were sometimes disappearing in the night, and that they often left their homes to search for them, but would find out that their children would be back in their rooms after hours of fruitless searching. This prompted me and a few other teenagers in the town to find out what was really going on. One of the people who led this endeavor was a girl named Nancy, who, as I've discovered through the Blue app, is now a nun somewhere in Mindanao. She proposed that we find a way to follow the children to wherever they go when they disappeared. We were not to stop them, mind you. We would simply try to find out where they actually go when they vanish. Needless to say, there was an element of danger to this, as pointed out by another town teen named Vincent. There was, possibly, a crime syndicate that could be brainwashing them, he postulated. With this in mind, we decided it would be best to proceed with the utmost caution if we were to do this. Finally, the day came, and it was Nancy who first sighted the three children leaving during Mass. We followed them as stealthily as possible, far enough to be difficult for the kids to see, but just enough to keep track of them. Overall, it felt weird and inappropriate for a bunch of teens to be stalking kids, but it was all we could do at the time. And so we followed them as far as we could until we reached an unfamiliar place on the island. Truth was, while we lived most of our childhoods on the island, there were certain parts of it that were off limits to us. Our parents often warned us not to go to the northern part of the island, as it was the site of a previous settlement that had been destroyed by a typhoon many years prior. They said that some of the buildings there still stood, but most had fallen apart or were in a severe state of disrepair. That was exactly how we found the settlement when we followed Dom, Lucy, and Roy. Most curious of all, though, was how the children gathered around a chapel at the center of town. It was clearly worn down and dilapidated, but most of its walls were intact, and while there was a large hole on the roof, it hadn't fallen into the building yet. However, it was hard to see the three kids inside, so one of us had to get closer to get a better look at what they were doing and who they could possibly be with inside. In the end, it was Vincent and Nancy who decided to take a closer look, as they were the smallest and sneakiest in our little team of, for lack of a better term, stalkers. They were the least likely to be seen or detected by the kids if they followed them closer to their hideout. We would come to discover that things were worse than we could have ever imagined. While they couldn't see it clearly, something terrible was in the church with the children. It was hard for them to see, but Nancy and Vincent could make out the form of a very tall woman in a body-covering black dress and a veil that concealed her head and face. Dom, Lucy, and Roy were looking up at the woman in awe and had brought her offerings of some kind. Dom brought the woman shoes, Lucy presented her food in the form of barbecue, and Roy offered small plastic toys. The veiled woman did not appear pleased at what they had brought as offerings. The woman flung their sacrifices aside and gestured angrily at them and their offerings, then pointed outside where Nancy and Vincent were hiding, or at least where they thought they were hidden. Frightened, Nancy and Vincent ran back to us and told everything they had seen and heard. When we got back to town, we told the grown-ups the same thing, including the parents of the three children and Father McAllister, who took on a very serious look. It became clear that things were worse than we initially thought. It was around then that it was decided we would have to do something to find out more. The other teens and I managed to convince Roy to tell us what he knew about the strange female figure he was seeing in the dilapidated chapel. It took us a bit of time and a lot of fried chicken with french fries, but we finally did get Roy to share with us what he knew. He cried, of course, when he knew the jig was up, but with our combined efforts of persuasion and good food, we got him to calm down and tell us everything. It all started on one Good Friday, when most of everyone was busy with the processions and other religious activities. He, Dom, and Lucy were just playing in the churchyard when they agreed to go to the abandoned town on the island. Roy became afraid when he realized how far they were from town and how his parents had warned against coming to this forsaken place. However, their fear was suppressed when they heard someone or something call to them from the rundown church in the center of the empty settlement. They entered the dilapidated chapel, and there they met a being that introduced itself as the Virgin Mary. Many of us were shocked by this, especially Roy's parents and Father McAllister. But, as the children would go on, whatever the thing they met was, it was far from holy. It told them to come back to its chapel on Sundays and not anywhere else, as people had already forgotten it. They are to do this always, and if they didn't, the veiled virgin would punish the inhabitants of the island by calling forth a storm that would bring about flooding and strong winds that would surely lay waste to our island. The veiled virgin would especially get angry when the children talked about the church in town where Father McAllister preached and told them never to go there. When the children talked about Jesus, the veiled virgin would also get livid, claiming that she hated mankind for killing her only son. She swore revenge against the world that slew her child and promised that she would destroy it all when the time came. She said that she would lay waste to the earth when her son would return in glory with his 7 heads and 10 horns. Father McAllister was especially disturbed by this, and he would later reveal that the veiled virgin was not describing Jesus, the Savior of all mankind, but the final form of the devil, the great red dragon of Revelation. However, this was not the only disturbing thing we would hear from Roy. Oh no. there was much more. A lot more, in fact. Roy also talked about how, whenever they tried to pray, the veiled virgin would become enraged as if she was being hurt and demand for them to stop. It would then tell them that there would be no need for them to pray in the forsaken chapel, as she was already there for them. Worse still, whenever they disobeyed the veiled virgin's commands, such as not frequenting the forsaken chapel and making offerings to her, she would visit them in their sleep to give them terrible nightmares. Roy told us about how the veiled virgin stalked them in their dreams to claw at them with its pale hands with long black fingernails that were more like claws. Father McAllister then decided it was time to take action. He told us to bring Dom, Lucy, and Roy together at the church, where he would try to deliver them from whatever spell the veiled virgin placed upon them. Note that he only said to deliver them, and made no mention of exorcisms or anything of the sort, which I thought would be more appropriate. When I asked the old priest about this, he only shook his head. He told me that he had neither the authority nor the training to perform such a ritual. I felt especially afraid then when he looked at me and I saw that he too was unsure. It was then he told me that he dearly hoped that what he knew would be enough to free the children from the curse upon them. We gathered Dom, Lucy, and Roy one Sunday afternoon before Mass with Father McAllister. The other teens and me, as well as a couple of the town's grown-ups, including the parents of the 3 children, as well as my own. We gathered them at the church in town as Father McAllister instructed and prevented them from leaving. Father McAllister then arrived with some of the women of the town trailing behind him, holding rosaries and prayer booklets. Father McAllister then tried to tell the children that what they had been speaking to and interacting with in the forsaken chapel in that abandoned town was most certainly not the Virgin Mary. It was some kind of evil spirit that was deceiving them into worshipping it. They were to halt any and all interactions with the dark being, which Father McAllister named the Veiled Virgin, and that they were never to go to the abandoned town ever again. And their parents were made to swear that they would never let their children out of their sight. The women and some of the men Father McAllister had with him then prayed over Dom, Lucy, and Roy, and we thought then that it was over. Big mistake there. In fact, not only did the horrific paranormal activity continue as if nothing happened, but it somehow got worse. This was when things got really scary. In all honesty, I didn't think that everyone would make it out okay after everything that started happening then. At first there were the nightmares. After we forbade the children from ever returning to the forsaken chapel, whatever it was that lived there started paying them regular visits in their dreams. And sometimes, the children not only had frequent nightmares and night terrors about the Veiled Virgin, but it would also often follow them into the waking world. The 3 of them would often be terrified out of their wits as the Veiled Virgin appeared to them in their dreams or even inside their rooms at night, spiteful and angry that they had stopped visiting her in the forsaken chapel. She would grab them by the hair and then choke them and claw at them with her blackened fingernails that were more like claws. The parents of the 3 children would find them huddled in the corners of their room, curled into fetal positions while desperately trying to protect themselves from the Veiled Virgin. To make matters worse, their parents would discover that their bodies were blemished with scratch marks, bruises, and worse, bite marks from what they claimed was from the Veiled Virgin. I and some of the others thought that perhaps they were self-inflicted, but soon realized that some of the wounds were impossible when we saw a clear, ugly-looking bite mark on Roy's lower back. Surely, he couldn't have bitten himself on that spot without seriously injuring his spine. Worse still, the size of the bite signified that it couldn't have come from anyone or anything as small as a child. It was even larger than what could be expected from an adult human. Right around then, Roy began to act strangely as he seemed to be the one affected the worst by the Veiled Virgin. Roy was possessed by the evil spirit since he was the one that betrayed her existence to us. Roy would speak in a raspy old woman's voice and say terrible things to his friends and family. He would speak of horrible things that would happen to the island now that no one makes offerings to the veiled virgin anymore. He would describe the awful fates of those who moved on in the afterlife and how they were tormented in hell. He would tell us of all the vile things going on all over the world, from theft, sexual assault, and unjust killing. The thing that spoke mostly clearly was not just the nonsense rambling of a child, but that of an evil and twisted creature that was simply using the child as a vessel, one that was both knowledgeable and cunning beyond what was humanly possible. We forbade the children from also seeing each other, as it was apparent that they were badly affected with what they experienced. Nowadays, people tend to call this PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition which is brought about by extreme stress. I'm guessing that's what those kids started getting when all this started happening. Finally, Father McAllister decided to do something drastic. He had us look after Dom, Lucy, and Roy while he sent forth a message to one of his colleagues in the church, another priest, one that was knowledgeable in the rite of exorcism. He arrived a few days later. By then, things had gotten a lot worse, and the children were in a terrible condition, especially Roy. The priest was from Canada, and we'll call him Father Calvert, who was quite young compared to Father McAllister. A kind and friendly man, Father Calvert mostly didn't seem like a serious person until he saw the state of the three children. He immediately became serious. Then, from the look of them and the way they behaved, he said that he would need to perform the rite of exorcism to free them. Sadly, I wasn't involved in the actual ritual. The people who took part in that were the two priests and the older family members of Dom, Lucy, and Roy. While I had been very helpful to them, Father McAllister said that only those who were fully prepared could participate, and merely witnessing the event without proper preparations could have disastrous results. He confided in me that whatever was possessing the three children could very easily move or jump into another new person, and youths, including teens like me, were actually very vulnerable to them. So reluctantly, we agreed but stayed close just in case. The rite took place on a Black Saturday in Dom's own home. We stayed close, but not even within the house's fence. We were in the neighboring house just in case we were needed. On that very day, the skies darkened to a point that it almost felt like the night during the midday. And while thunder and lightning threatened, not a single drop of rain fell from the sky. There were also the strange noises and smells that came from Dom's house. While we weren't able to directly see the ritual taking place, its effects were clear and sinister. It got so bad to the point that the owner of the house we were staying in shut the doors and windows to shut out the sounds and smells coming from the house next door. As lightning danced across the sky above and thunder rumbled like rolling boulders, the people in the other house enacted the rite of exorcism to free the three children from whatever it was that was influencing them. Then, the earth beneath us suddenly shook, and I thought that there was an earthquake that was now accompanying the storm above us. But thankfully, the earthquake ended just as quickly, and some of the parents of the three children came out of the house. It was over. The evil spirit tormenting Dom, Lucy, and Roy had been driven away. It was now time to rebuild the lives of the three children and that of their families. In the days that followed, the grown-ups of our town, along with us teenagers of course, tore down the remains of the abandoned town and had both Father McAllister and Father Calvert to cleanse its remains of any residual evil. We demolished it completely, including and especially the forsaken chapel at its heart, crushing the wood and stone that composed it, and then burning what was left with the two priests reciting prayers to make sure whatever inhabited it would be gone for good. All of the dilapidated buildings were demolished, and not a single structure, even if it had already been reduced to rubble, was ignored. In the end, there was nothing left of that abandoned town, and in its place was left a simple memorial to commemorate the people who once lived there. I learned from my own parents that the abandoned town was once a bustling settlement built by fishermen until a freak storm and a tsunami swept it all away. While I did not witness the ritual directly, they told me that the evil spirit that bewitched Dom, Lucy, and Roy was the result of a strange occult practice that the people on that abandoned town once did. Even then, as we built a great bonfire to burn away all the remains of the demolished buildings of that abandoned town, the skies above darkened and a weak drizzle threatened to put out the fire. But as the priests led all of us in prayer, the bonfire roared against the downpour like a defiant beast against a terrible opponent. You could see it in how the fire blazed even brighter as the day wore on from late afternoon to early evening. When everything was said and done, we all went home under a bright moon that promised an end to the awful nightmare, to what we just all went through as a community. This is the only strange story I have about my town, but there were actually more after I left this place and worked in other parts of the Philippines. I think I'll share them with you when I have more time. Of course, like they say, those stories will be for another time.